This happened 2 years ago. Now I'm a female and live alone in an apartment building. Like many people, I have an Instagram page that I post on pretty regularly. I would say I post on average at least once a month. I enjoy posting pictures on Instagram, but I know that occasionally you have to deal with a bot or a creepy person. For the most part, I hadn't had any bad experiences until this happened. One day, I opened the Instagram app and saw that I had a direct message. It was from one of my followers, a guy named Tim. I didn't know him, and I didn't follow him either. I'm not sure how long he had been following me for, but he sent me a message asking if I could come and hang out with him. I found this to be kind of weird and did not respond. I mean, he didn't even have a conversation with me, and I didn't know him. He couldn't possibly expect me to just say yes. And based on his profile picture, I wasn't interested in him. I figured that he wouldn't message me again after that. But the next day, he sent me another message. He once more asked me to hang out with him and said that he could pick me up. This time I responded and said no thanks. I appreciate the offer though. Now he had to understand that I wasn't interested. Tim then tried to convince me, but I ignored him. I didn't really know why he was sending me these messages, seemingly out of nowhere. The next day, I didn't get any more messages from him. I figured that he would stop communicating with me at that point. The following night, I went grocery shopping after work. I would go shopping occasionally here and there whenever I needed to. I didn't have a particular routine or anything. I was inside of the store shopping for about 20 minutes. The time was probably about 8 p.m. or so. After I was done shopping, I headed out to my car in the parking lot. By now, it was mostly quiet, but there were a few people here and there. I got all the way to my vehicle, only to see that there was a car parked next to me. I started to take my groceries out of the cart and put them in my car. That's when the door opened to the car next to me, and a guy got out. I did not recognize him. He just seemed like another guy going shopping, but he didn't walk to the store, and instead headed straight for me. At first, I was confused, but then he said my name and asked me why I thought I could ignore him. I realized that it was Tim from Instagram, and I did recognize him from his picture. At that point, I was too confused to say anything though. He said that he was here now, and we were together, so we may as well hang out. I finally spoke and asked him what he was doing and how he knew I would be here. He claimed that it was a coincidence. I finished putting my groceries in my car and said that I had to get home. I closed my trunk and then tried to walk around him to my driver's door, but he stopped me by my house. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was unusual for anyone to knock on the back door, especially at that time of night. I cautiously approached the door, trying to peer through the small window to see who it was, but the darkness outside obscured any view. Feeling uneasy, I called out, "Who's there?" There was a moment of silence before a voice replied, "It's Rhonda. I just wanted to talk." My heart raced. How did she know where I lived? Why was she here so late? I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Should I open the door and confront her? Or should I ignore her and hope she would go away? Before I could decide, there was another knock, more insistent this time. I backed away from the door, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I considered calling Thomas or the police, but I didn't want to escalate the situation without knowing more. As I hesitated, the knocking stopped, and there was only silence. I waited, listening intently for any sound, but there was nothing. Eventually, I cautiously approached the back door again and looked through the window. There was no one there, Rhonda was gone. Feeling shaken, I double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked before retreating to my room. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered long after Rhonda's unexpected visit. The next day, I went to class as usual, trying to push the incident out of my mind. But when I checked my Instagram later that day, I saw that Rhonda had unfollowed me, and her account was nowhere to be found. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief mixed with lingering apprehension. Who was Rhonda? And why did she come to my house unannounced? I may never know the answers, but one thing was for sure. I would be more cautious about who I interacted with online from that day forward. To a post on Instagram. Curious, I clicked on the link, and it took me to a photo that had been posted on a public Instagram page. The photo was of me, taken from my own Instagram account. The caption read, "Isn't she lovely? #stunning, #beautiful, #creepy cameraman." My heart skipped a beat as I realized that someone had been taking photos of me without my knowledge. I scrolled through the comments, feeling a sense of dread rising within me. Some people were complimenting my appearance, while others made lewd remarks. It made my skin crawl to think that someone had been watching me without my consent. I quickly checked my Instagram account, but there were no messages or notifications from anyone suspicious. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, though, and I spent the rest of the night checking and double-checking all the locks on my doors and windows. The next day, I couldn't concentrate at work. I kept thinking about the photo and wondering who could have taken it. Was it someone I knew, or was it a stranger who had been following me? When I got home that evening, I went through all my social media accounts, blocking anyone who seemed suspicious or unfamiliar. I also reported the photo to Instagram, hoping they would take it down. Despite my efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I left my apartment, I felt like someone was following me. I started taking different routes to work and looking over my shoulder constantly. Weeks went by, and I tried to convince myself that it was just a prank or a coincidence. But deep down, I knew that someone out there was watching me, and it terrified me. Then, one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise coming from the hallway outside my apartment. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. My heart pounding, I tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. To my horror, I saw a figure standing outside, dressed in dark clothing, with a hood pulled low over their face. They were holding something in their hand, but I couldn't make out what it was. I froze, my mind racing with fear. Was it the person who had been taking photos of me? What did they want? Should I call the police? Before I could make a decision, the figure suddenly turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too terrified to move. Eventually, I gathered the courage to call the police and report what had happened. They came and searched the building, but found no sign of the intruder. They told me to stay vigilant and call them if anything else happened. From that day on, I lived in constant fear, always looking over my shoulder and jumping at every little noise. I never found out who was taking photos of me or why, but the experience left me deeply traumatized. I eventually moved to a new apartment in a different neighborhood, hoping to leave the nightmare behind me. But to this day, I still can't shake the feeling of being watched, and I live in fear that one day, the person who terrorized me will come back for me. Popular spot with joggers and families, especially in the evenings. As I strolled along the winding paths, enjoying the fresh air and sunshine, I noticed a man sitting alone on a bench up ahead. He seemed to be watching me intently, which made me feel a little uneasy, but I tried to brush it off as paranoia. I continued on my way, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw the man still sitting on the bench, his gaze fixed on me. It made my skin crawl, and I quickened my pace, eager to get out of his line of sight. As I passed by the bench where the man was sitting, he suddenly stood up and started walking in my direction. My heart leaped into my throat, and I broke into a cold sweat. Instinctively, I reached for my phone, ready to call for help if I needed to. "Excuse me, miss," the man called out, his voice low and gravelly. I hesitated, unsure if I should respond or just keep walking. But before I could make a decision, he spoke again. "I couldn't help but notice how beautiful you are," he said, his tone unnervingly familiar. "Would you mind if I took a photo of you? You would make a lovely addition to my collection." I froze, my mind racing with fear and disbelief. Was this man serious? Did he really think it was okay to take photos of strangers without their consent? I felt a surge of anger and indignation, but I didn't want to provoke him further. "No, thank you," I managed to stammer, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't feel comfortable with that." The man's expression hardened, and for a moment, I quickly made my way out of the park and headed home, feeling a sense of unease that lingered long after the encounter. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation, and I vowed to be more cautious in the future. Since that day, I've been extra vigilant when out in public, always keeping an eye out for anyone who might pose a threat. And while I've never encountered that man again, the memory of our encounter continues to haunt me, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk in the world around us. Would glance around nervously, but he made no move to leave. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for the police to arrive, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. When the officers finally arrived, I let out a sigh of relief. I quickly explained the situation to them, telling them about the man who had been following me and how he had somehow found my Instagram profiles. They listened intently, nodding as I spoke. After taking down my statement, the officers went to speak with the man outside my door. I watched anxiously from inside, praying that they would be able to resolve the situation quickly and safely. To my surprise, the man didn't resist when the officers approached him. He seemed almost relieved to see them, as if he had been waiting for them to arrive. They spoke with him briefly before escorting him away from the building. I breathed a sigh of relief as I watched them go, grateful that the ordeal was finally over. But even as the adrenaline began to fade, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the pit of my stomach. The police assured me that they would keep an eye on the area and patrol more frequently in case the man returned. They also advised me to be extra cautious and to report any further incidents immediately. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I left my apartment, I felt a sense of paranoia, constantly looking over my shoulder and scanning the crowd for any sign of the man who had been following me. But as the weeks passed and nothing else happened, I slowly began to relax. I changed my routine, taking different routes to and from work and avoiding the park where the incident had occurred. And while I never found out who the man was or why he had been following me, I was grateful to be safe and to have the support of the police and my friends. From that day on, I made a conscious effort to be more vigilant and to trust my instincts when it came to my safety. I may never know the full extent of what happened, but I refused to let fear control my life as well, and tried to focus on my job. But the messages kept coming from different numbers each time. They were relentless, demanding more money and threatening me if I didn't comply. I felt like I was being harassed, and it made me incredibly anxious. I confided in a coworker about what was happening, and they suggested I go to the police. At first, I was hesitant. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but as the messages continued to pour in, I realized I needed help. After my shift, I went to the nearest police station and explained the situation to them. They listened sympathetically and assured me they would look into it. They advised me to keep a record of all the messages and to contact them immediately if the harassment escalated. For the next few days, I tried to ignore the messages as best as I could, but they were relentless, coming at all hours of the day and night. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was always lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. I started to feel paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every little noise. I couldn't focus at work, and my anxiety levels were through the roof. One day, as I was walking home from work, I felt like I was being followed. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the feeling, but the footsteps behind me only seemed to get closer. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a figure looming in the darkness. My heart raced, and I broke into a run, desperate to get away. But no matter how fast I ran, the figure seemed to keep pace with me, always just a few steps behind. Terrified, I finally reached my apartment building and dashed inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I had to do something to protect myself. So I went back to the police and filed a formal report. They took it seriously, launching an investigation into the harassment. Meanwhile, I took steps to increase my security, installing security cameras outside my apartment and changing my phone number. I also reached out to friends and family for support, knowing that I couldn't face this alone. Slowly but surely, the harassment began to taper off. The messages became less frequent, and the figure following me seemed to disappear. I still don't know who was behind it all, but I'm grateful to have the ordeal behind me. Ever experienced, I couldn't believe that someone would go to such lengths to scare and intimidate me. The thought of someone threatening not only my life, but also the lives of my loved ones, filled me with a sense of dread and helplessness. For weeks, I lived in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every little noise. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the looming threat hanging over me. But slowly, with the help of the police and my loved ones, I began to regain a sense of security. I took precautions to protect myself, changing my routines and being extra vigilant. And over time, the messages and threats began to fade away. Now, looking back on that terrifying ordeal, I realize just how vulnerable we can be in this digital age. It's easy for someone to hide behind a screen and terrorize others with no consequences. But I refuse to let fear control me. I refuse to let this experience define me. I've learned to be more cautious, more aware of the dangers that lurk in the shadows. And while I may never know who was behind those messages or why they targeted me, I'm grateful to be safe and surrounded by people who care about me. I may have been shaken, but I refuse to be broken. I refuse to let fear dictate my life. And no matter what challenges may come my way, I know that I have the strength and resilience to overcome them. In closing, these stories illustrate the dark and often unnerving aspects of our digital age, from encounters with strangers on social media to threats of violence and intimidation. Each narrative serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind our screens. But amidst the fear and uncertainty, there is also resilience and strength. Each protagonist faced their ordeal with courage and determination. Refusing to be paralyzed by fear, they sought help from authorities, leaned on the support of loved ones, and took steps to protect themselves. While the scars of these experiences may linger, they serve as powerful lessons in vigilance and self-preservation. As we navigate the complexities of our interconnected world, may we remain ever vigilant, ever aware, and ever ready to stand up against those who seek to harm us. Let these stories serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder to trust our instincts, safeguard our privacy, and never underestimate the power of solidarity in the face of adversity. And may we all strive to create a safer, more compassionate digital landscape for ourselves and future generations. In the end, it is our resilience, our unity, and our unwavering commitment to justice that will prevail over the darkness, shining a light of hope into even the darkest corners of our digital world.